Please subscribe and share for more story. 1 week before Christmas, Margaret Hale, a 68-year-old widow, stood alone in her kitchen waiting for the coffee maker to finish brewing. The smell of dark roast filled the room, while an old holiday song played softly on the radio. The December morning was cold and gray, the kind that pressed against the windows and settled into the bones. Margaret wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself and stared at the counter. For a moment, everything felt calm. Then she heard voices drifting in from the living room. Her daughter Lydia was on the phone, laughing easily, the sound carefree and light. Margaret didn't mean to listen, but something in Lydia's tone made her pause at the doorway. She stood still, one hand resting against the frame, her breath slowing as she listened. "It's all sorted," Lydia said brightly. "We'll leave all 7 kids with Mom. She doesn't have anything else going on anyway." She laughed again, careless and unguarded. "Ethan already booked the spa, and we're heading to the resort. Finally, a peaceful Christmas." Margaret felt the words land like ice in her chest. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Lydia continued talking as if nothing important had been said. "Caleb and Nora are doing the same thing. Vermont this year. Mom already bought the gifts and paid for the catering. We'll just show up on the 25th, eat, and leave." Perfect, Lydia called it. Perfect for everyone except Margaret. Her hands trembled, not from age, but from a cold rage she hadn't felt in years. Margaret turned quietly and walked back into the kitchen. She poured the finished coffee down the sink without tasting it. Each movement felt deliberate, heavy, final. She climbed the stairs slowly, one step at a time, as if each stair carried a memory. In her bedroom, she closed the door with a soft click and sat on the edge of the bed. Margaret Hale, 68 years old, widowed for 12 years. A mother of 2 who had just been reduced, in one careless sentence, to a free service. She adored her 7 grandchildren, but now they were being used as justification to trap her while their parents escaped. It wasn't a request. It was an assumption. And that realization hurt more than any shouted insult ever could. She looked around her bedroom, at the walls filled with framed moments. Graduations, baptisms, school photos. In every picture, Margaret was there, smiling, holding something, fixing something, standing slightly to the side. She was always present but never central. She walked to her closet and stared at the neatly stacked gift bags. 7 expensive presents, chosen carefully over months. She had spent more than $1,500 from her pension, skipping dentist visits and new clothes to make it happen. On the dresser lay the catering receipt. Another $1,000. Enough food for 18 people. She had done it all willingly, believing that love meant giving without limits. Sitting on the bed again, Margaret finally understood how deeply mistaken she had been. The memories came fast and sharp. Last Christmas, she cooked for 2 days straight while her back ached and her feet swelled. Lydia arrived late, distracted, and left early. "We got another party," Lydia had said, kissing the air near Margaret's cheek. Caleb and Nora did the same, leaving all 7 children behind. Margaret stayed up bathing them, comforting one sick child, setting up mattresses. She fell asleep at 2 in the morning and woke again before dawn. The year before had been no different. By 9 p.m., she was alone with dirty dishes and torn wrapping paper. And then there was her birthday, last August. She baked herself a small cake and waited. No calls. One late text. Caleb didn't remember at all. That was when she realized she had become invisible. Margaret opened her eyes and looked again at the gift bags. The rage inside her shifted, hardening into clarity. She picked up her phone and scrolled past her children's names until she found Helen Moore, her friend of 40 years. Helen had invited her to spend Christmas at a small rental by the sea. Margaret had declined at the time. "I have to be with the family," she had said. Now she dialed. Helen answered immediately. "Margaret? Everything okay?" Margaret surprised herself with how steady her voice sounded. "Is that invitation still open?" Helen laughed softly. "It's been open for 10 years. When do we leave?" Margaret closed her eyes. "The 23rd, she said. "That sounds perfect." After the call, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with her planner and a pen. She wrote a new list. Not groceries. Cancellations. First, cancel catering. $1,000 returned. Money she had saved carefully. Second, return gifts. $1,500. Money spent on people who didn't plan to be present. She closed the notebook and breathed deeply. That afternoon, she remembered her 65th birthday. The silence. The empty house. The text messages that came too late. She remembered every time her children called only when they needed something. Mom, can you watch the kids? Mom, can you lend us money? Never. Mom, how are you? She had mistaken usefulness for love. And now she was done. The next morning, Margaret made the calls. She canceled the catering. She returned nearly every gift, store by store, cashier by cashier. When asked if something was wrong, she simply said, "I changed my mind." By the end of the day, most of the money was back in her account. The remaining gifts were donated quietly. That night, Lydia called. "Do you need us to pick anything up?" "No," Margaret replied calmly. "Everything's handled." Caleb texted about dropping off the kids.
She didn't respond.
On December 23rd, Helen's car pulled into the driveway. Margaret locked her door behind her and walked away with one small bag and a sense of freedom she barely recognized. The trip was peaceful. Ocean air. Laughter. Quiet mornings. Margaret ignored the flood of calls and messages. On Christmas Day, they ate seafood at a small restaurant and laughed until it hurt. When Margaret finally answered her phone, Caleb exploded. "You ruined everything," he shouted. Margaret listened calmly. "You didn't lose Christmas," she said. "You lost your free caretaker." When he mentioned her late husband, she ended the call with finality. Back home weeks later, her children stood on the porch demanding explanations. Margaret met them at the door, unflinching. "I am not your servant," she said. "I am a person." They left angry and stunned. Months passed in quiet growth. Margaret joined a painting class. She made friends. She reclaimed herself. One spring afternoon, Caleb returned alone. He apologized.
Truly.
Margaret listened. She didn't rush forgiveness. "Respect first," she said. He agreed. As he left, Margaret looked at the new painting on her wall, an older woman staring out at the sea, calm and unshaken. Margaret smiled softly. For the first time in her life, she knew she was no longer invisible. The weeks after Caleb's visit passed quietly, but the silence felt different now. It was no longer heavy or punishing. It was peaceful. Margaret filled her days with small routines that belonged only to her. She attended her painting class twice a week and lingered afterward for coffee with the other women. They talked about books, sore knees, regrets, and laughter came easily. At home, she rearranged furniture that had not moved in years, opening space where clutter once ruled. One afternoon, Lydia sent a short text. "Hope you're well." Margaret stared at it. For a long moment, she didn't reply immediately. For once, she didn't feel rushed. When she finally responded hours later with a simple "I am," she felt no guilt. That alone felt like progress. She was learning that distance could be healthy, that love did not require constant sacrifice. In early May, Lydia finally called. Her voice was hesitant, stripped of its old confidence. "Mom, do you have a minute?" Margaret sat at the kitchen table, sunlight warming the wood. "I do," she said evenly. There was a pause. "I didn't realize how much you did," Lydia admitted. "When you left, everything fell apart." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "That's because it was never supposed to rest on one person," she replied. Lydia sighed. "I know. I was angry, but I've been thinking." Margaret listened without interrupting. That was new too, letting others speak without rescuing them. "I miss you," Lydia said softly. "I miss being your daughter, not just someone who needs things." Margaret's voice stayed calm. "If we're going to try again, it will be slowly, with respect." Lydia agreed. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a doorway. Summer arrived gently. Margaret planted flowers in her garden and watched them grow, something she hadn't had time for in years. Caleb visited occasionally, never unannounced, always asking first. He stayed for tea, not favors. Lydia followed his lead, cautious but sincere. The grandchildren came one afternoon, laughing and loud, and Margaret welcomed them with open arms, but only for the afternoon. When Lydia asked if they could stay overnight, Margaret smiled kindly and said, "Not this time." Lydia hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." That single word meant more than 1,000 apologies. For the first time, Margaret felt seen not as a resource, but as a woman with limits. She realized she hadn't lost her family by setting boundaries. She had given them a chance to meet her properly. One evening, Margaret sat alone in her living room, looking again at the painting of the woman by the sea. The calm expression mirrored how she felt inside now, steady, grounded. She thought back to the years she had spent shrinking herself, believing love meant erasing her own needs. No one had forced her into that role. She had stepped into it willingly, afraid of being left behind. Now she understood that love built on fear was never real love. It was obligation. And obligation, she had learned, could be broken. Margaret opened her journal and wrote, "I am allowed to take up space." The words felt strange, but right. She closed the book with a quiet smile. By autumn, Margaret's life felt full in a way it never had before. Not busy, full. She still loved her children and grandchildren deeply, but that love no longer came at the cost of herself. On her 69th birthday, Lydia and Caleb arrived together with a cake on time. They stayed. They talked. When they left, Margaret stood in her doorway and watched them go without ache or expectation. She returned inside, brewed tea, and sat beneath the soft glow of her lamp. For decades, she had waited to be chosen. Now she understood something far more powerful. She could choose herself, and everything else could grow from there. As winter approached again, Margaret felt a quiet awareness settle inside her. The season no longer filled her with dread. One afternoon, Lydia called and asked carefully, "What are you thinking about Christmas this year?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked out the window at the bare trees and considered the question honestly. "I haven't decided yet," she said. Lydia exhaled, nervous but respectful. "Okay, just let me know." The call ended without pressure, without guilt. Margaret smiled to herself. A year ago, that conversation would have been unthinkable. Back then, expectations would have been set without her consent. Now, she had space to choose. That space felt like a gift she had given herself. A few days later, Caleb stopped by with coffee and pastries. They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the floor. "I want to say something," he began. "I didn't just take advantage of your time. I took advantage of your kindness." Margaret met his eyes. "Yes, you did." He nodded, accepting it without argument. "I'm trying to teach my kids to do better," he said. "To see people, not use them." Margaret felt something warm bloom in her chest. "That matters," she replied. "More than you know." When he left, she realized she no longer felt the need to lecture or explain herself. Being heard was enough. December arrived quietly. Margaret decided to spend Christmas Eve at home and Christmas Day with Helen by the sea again. When she told Lydia and Caleb, neither protested. "That sounds nice," Lydia said and meant it. On Christmas morning, Margaret woke late, brewed coffee, and read by the window. Her phone buzzed with messages, simple ones this time. "Merry Christmas, Mom." No demands followed. Later, she packed a small bag and drove to the coast. As the ocean came into view, she felt the same freedom she had felt the year before, but steadier now. This wasn't an escape anymore.
It was a choice.
That evening, Margaret and Helen walked along the beach, bundled against the cold wind. "You're different," Helen said gently. Margaret laughed. "I know. I finally met myself." They talked about aging, about fear, about how women were taught to disappear quietly. "Not us," Helen said. Margaret smiled. "Not anymore." The waves rolled in and out, constant and unbothered. Watching them, Margaret understood something important. Boundaries hadn't taken love away from her life. They had made room for the right kind of love to stay. When Margaret returned home after the holidays, she hung a new photograph beside the painting of the woman by the sea. It was a simple picture, just her, standing on the beach, hair caught in the wind, smiling without effort. No one else in the frame. And that was the point. She looked at it for a long moment before turning out the lights. Margaret Hale, once invisible, now stood fully in her own life. She wasn't waiting to be chosen anymore. She had already made her choice, and it was herself. Spring returned softly, and with it came small, careful changes. Lydia began stopping by occasionally, not to ask for help, but to sit. Sometimes they drank tea in the kitchen without an agenda. Other times they walked through the neighborhood in silence. One afternoon, Lydia admitted, "I didn't know who I was without you fixing everything." Margaret nodded. "Neither did I," she said. The honesty between them was still fragile, but it was real. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic apologies, just steady effort. Margaret understood now that repair didn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it arrived quietly, through consistency and restraint. The grandchildren adjusted too. They learned that visits were scheduled, not assumed. When they came, Margaret was fully present, playing games, baking cookies, listening to their stories. When it was time for them to leave, she hugged them without exhaustion behind her smile. One of the younger ones once asked, "Grandma, why don't we stay all the time anymore?" Margaret knelt and answered honestly, "Because everyone needs their own space to be happy." The child accepted this easily, as children often do. Watching that, Margaret realized how simple boundaries could be when adults stopped complicating them. There were moments of doubt. Late at night, Margaret sometimes wondered if she had waited too long to change. But those thoughts passed. Her life now held things she had never allowed herself before: classes, friendships, quiet mornings, unhurried meals. She no longer explained herself endlessly. When Lydia once suggested she host a large family gathering, Margaret smiled and said, "Not this year." Lydia hesitated, then replied, "Okay, we'll figure something else out." No anger followed. No guilt. That alone told Margaret she had done the right thing. On a warm afternoon, Margaret returned to the beach alone. She sat on a bench overlooking the water, the same place where everything had shifted. She thought about the woman she had been, the one who believed love meant disappearing. That woman wasn't weak, Margaret realized. She had simply been taught the wrong lessons. Growth didn't erase her past. It honored it. She whispered softly to herself, "You did your best." And for the first time, she believed it without needing anyone else to agree. That evening, Margaret went home, made herself dinner, and turned on a small lamp in the living room. The painting of the woman by the sea glowed warmly on the wall. Margaret sat beneath it, peaceful and whole. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She had learned that love rooted in respect endures, and love rooted in sacrifice alone eventually breaks. Margaret Hale closed her eyes, breathing evenly, no longer invisible, no longer waiting. She had finally stepped fully into her own life, and she intended to stay there. Thanks for watching. If you value stories of respect, dignity, and justice, please subscribe. It means more than you know, and it lets me keep sharing the lessons life has carved into me.